Hey guys, how's it going? In the lead up to Path of Exile 2's release, I've been asking myself, have grinding gear games done enough to make their sequel appeal to the wider ARPG and gaming audiences? Will they actually succeed in bringing in new players? Or will the perception of Path of Exile being unfriendly and confusing keep turning people away? It's widely known that Path of Exile is a ball ache to get into. Its systems are deep and complex, they're not well defined within the game world itself, and require players to seek help from wikis, third-party sites, or online tutorials to fully understand what's at play. It's fairly common for new players coming into Path of Exile to drop off early because of this lack of cohesion, and then return months or years later before finally getting into it. But how many of those actually return, and how many never bother? This story is so common, it's also my story. It's the story of two of my close friends, and it's also Octavian's story, one of the current employees at Grinding Gear Games. All of us tried PoE the first time, dropped off early, and then didn't truly appreciate the game until months or years later, when we gave it another shot and put in the time. It's an incredible experience once you wrap your head around it, but early on, it's so obscure and unfriendly in the way it presents information that I can't blame people who fall off, because if you're thinking the game's obscure early on, why would you expect that to change? So let's talk about why Path of Exile is considered to have such a high barrier to entry, look at what Path of Exile 2 is doing differently, and discuss whether Path of Exile 2 will inherit the same public perception of being too complex. Starting with the obvious, Path of Exile is just massive, and has been suffering from being bloated for years. Years and years of development and subsequent leagues, 10 campaign acts, multiple endgame systems, over 300 skills and 1300 passive nodes that all combine in weird and wonderful ways. And all of this coming with very few restrictions. That in itself is just a lot to take in. When you have this many options, a lot of players face decision paralysis. They don't know where to start, and early on, Path of Exile does very little to guide players in their decision making. Now I should say, that's both a massive strength of the series, especially for those that like to explore and unlock new experiences, but it's also a significant weakness. Without guidance, without an idea of what to pick, players often get lost. They choose a skill they think sounds cool, but then it doesn't function as they'd imagined, and it turns them away, because they can't always choose what they'd envisioned. And one key example of this is that Path of Exile doesn't make it clear when certain skills become available to you, or what skills even exist. Let's say I'm a new player, and I've seen gameplay online and want to recreate it. How do I move in that direction to match what I saw? What should I do if I want to summon skeletons? Where do I find that skill? Where do I find that information? Path of Exile does nothing in-game to tell you, and for your casual audience, that is a massive turn-off, and understandably so. If I've seen a game, particularly an ARPG that lets players be a necromancer, but when I start the game, I have no idea how to do that, should I continue playing? It's just not possible for a new player to know this information without leaving the game and searching online, or by playing an unknown amount of time and just kind of hoping that that information presents itself. Not something you want your players experiencing during the first hour of your game. But this is something Path of Exile 2 is improving significantly. I could give other examples of PoE 1 being obscure, but to avoid just endlessly looking over its tough nature, let's move on. Now this might sound like such a simple mechanic, but Path of Exile 2's new Uncut Gems system does more than just let you pick any skill from the list available at that gem tier. It also educates players on what's to come. It gives you a glimpse at the future, at the abilities you'll be able to select later. All in-game, all of this in the same location you're using to choose your next skill. And this is what's important. For veteran players, this doesn't impact them. It doesn't get in their way. It doesn't slow them down. But for new players, it's an incredible moment. To use my skeleton summoning example, if a player jumps into Path of Exile 2 and decides they want to use skeletons because they saw the Witch trailer, within the first 10 minutes of the game, they can look at the available skills in that realm. They can see that skeleton warriors and snipers are available for tier 1 gems. At tier 5, they'll have skeleton mages. And at gem tier 13, they can summon clerics. Just having this information available in-game is such an insane improvement. The player now knows the path they can take. They can see the road ahead of them. They don't have to wait until the option appears. They can see it. They don't have to just hope that they will eventually arrive at that destination. They will learn quickly that gems begin dropping at higher tiers as they progress, and each time an uncut gem drops at a tier above the last, they will see that progress towards their goal. This might sound like I'm fangirling over the most basic of features, but it is this simple stuff that Path of Exile was missing, and why it turned away a larger audience. Having information in-game isn't a crutch, it often elevates the experience. If I'm continuing that example, every step towards a skeleton cleric, I'm going to be excited. When I see my first tier 10 uncut gem, I know I'm so much closer from the first moment a tier 1 or 5 dropped. It builds suspense into the game, something that many players would get instead from a build guide for Path of Exile 1. Have you ever been leveling an alt in Path of Exile, knowing that when you hit level 60 you'll be able to equip a unique armor that will completely redefine your build, and then the satisfaction when you reach that level and your DPS skyrockets? It's the same feeling. Knowing you're getting close to reaching the goal of unlocking a skill, a small goal, but one you would unconsciously have. That isn't present in Path of Exile 1 for new players, because the game gives them no indication of what to expect, but this simple change achieves that in Path of Exile 2. And as I mentioned, it isn't just this one aspect that makes Path of Exile look incredibly complex. A big part of this is that the game has functionally been solved. This is something I've heard Jonathan reference in some interviews, and I find it to be quite an interesting topic. Given the age of information we live in, when something is added to Path of Exile like a new league mechanic, within a week there will be guides on it, wiki updates, community discussions, and dissections of data. Players will run the mechanics thousands of times and record their drops to determine drop percentages. Path of Exile has a very hardcore community who love to min-max and will eke out every ounce of information to maximize their runs or their build. With this comes the reality that there is very little mystery left in the game, and with a game so large, this also floods the community with information. A massive strength to those that like deep systems or are heavily invested in the game and don't need to inform themselves on what's been in the past. But it's a massive turn-off for players who have seen that Path of Exile has been running for over a decade and are worried about being left behind. Now, this isn't a complaint. This is largely unavoidable in itself, and is a symptom of a studio that loved their game and wanted to continue bringing it to new heights. Path of Exile 2, however, represents a fresh start for everyone, and in particular new players. I've seen comments on my recent videos relating to this. People saying that they're looking forward to playing Path of Exile 2, that they didn't play PoE 1 because they found it too obscure, or that because so many leaks have been released, they felt they were too far behind, and that they're looking forward to jumping in day one alongside the community, instead of feeling like they're behind. And from what I've seen, those new players won't be easily turned off. Path of Exile 2 is bringing with it a host of other improvements for new players. For the first time in the series' history, it will recommend support gems to players, with these options representing choices that benefit that skill either by increasing its damage, altering how it functions, or other changes to its expression. This is something Grinding Gear Games have done in order to streamline the experience for new players, giving them the option of trying these supports and guiding them in a direction, but again, without losing that complexity for veterans who can still choose any gem they want. We'll also be seeing improved early game tutorials that will highlight where you need to look for information, show you how to dodge roll, show you how to use flasks, and encourage you to explore these systems by pausing to give the player a moment to understand what they need to do early on. There looks to be a much higher level of early guidance for players who want or need it, and none of what I've seen looks to get in the way of the game's deep or complex systems. It instead instills players with knowledge of the basics, and then lets them unfurl the rest as they play, because once a player knows the foundations they're standing on, and once they can see the possible paths ahead, they can forge their own path through it. Guidance early on doesn't mean hand-holding to completion. It means giving players the tools to understand what's happening now, and build their understanding as it grows in complexity. Alongside this, we've also seen systems streamlined in their implementation, like skills now being separated from gear, meaning new players will no longer need to worry about finding the right color sockets or the right amount of linked sockets. A system I know some are disappointed to see go, but will absolutely improve the game's feel for new players, without sacrificing build diversity. This is something I'm torn on. I love needing to make the choice based on the pros and cons, but it always felt a little bit cheap when I didn't have the currency to bring the item into a place it was usable, like the game had presented me with an option and then torn it away. Path of Exile 2 really is shedding some of the weight from its more obscure and complex systems like this. Something likely worth debating, as losing that link between skills and gear was almost iconic to the series, but ultimately does streamline the game and make it more accessible. That, in my view, is what really matters, but I could be swayed either way. Now, my opinion on it overall is that they've cut the fat that was necessary. From what I've seen as someone who's not had a hands-on experience with Path of Exile 2, the streamlining they've done on those systems mentioned won't impact on my enjoyment of the game. I believe the improvements in the tutorials I've seen to date and in giving players information on skills and other systems is going to be incredibly fruitful in keeping players engaged instead of having them drop off early and then hoping that they return later. Grinding Gear Games have spoken about doing a lot of new user testing for this, where they intentionally find people who never played Path of Exile and have them try Path of Exile 2 to get unbiased advice on how well the game is displaying its information. They've monitored how those players interacted with systems, and in one example, found many new players failing to notice their life dropping and not using flasks to replenish. So they implemented new visual systems to highlight to players that they're low on health, subtly, and without being overbearing to the more experienced players that will benefit less from this. They've specifically taken time to test their game with new users, which I'm incredibly thankful for, because I want to get more friends into Path of Exile too, and see that community grow. I do believe PoE 2 will retain some of that public perception of being complex, simply because it is a sequel to Path of Exile, but from what I've seen, I cannot imagine new players in PoE 2 repeating that pattern seen in the original, that being picking up the game, finding it too obscure and turning it off. PoE 2 looks to really explain how it functions to new players from the early footage I've seen, and do it in a way that encourages exploration. But these are just my thoughts. What do you think? Either as a brand new player eager to jump into Path of Exile 2, or as a PoE veteran? Do you think Path of Exile 2 is going to bring in a fresh audience to join the old? Or do you see it largely catering to those already heavily invested in the franchise? I'd love to hear your thoughts and chat it out, so throw a comment down below, and I'll see you there. Path of Exile 2 is now 5 weeks away from release, following its second delay this week, and is releasing into early access on December 6th. I'm still hyped as ever, and I'm dying to get in and start trying out all these new classes, skills, and systems. Thanks for tuning in, guys. If you liked the video and want to help the channel, you already know how. Throw a like on the video, and sub if you want to see more, but you being here, that's more than enough. Have a great one, guys. Let me know your thoughts on this in the comments, and I'll catch you down there to chat all things Path of Exile 2. Cheers.